Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be looking at photography. Now, a few chapters ago we looked at printmaking, and photography is really a kind of printmaking. In fact, we looked at a process called screen printing, or silk screening, or serigraphy, which nobody ever calls it, which in many ways is a kind of photographic process. It uses a light emulsion, a light sensitive emulsion. So you're going to be familiar a little bit with photography, and I think most of you have probably taken a picture or two before, right? I hope so. So the word photography comes from the Greek word drawing with light, literally photo, light, graphy, writing. And there's two basic ways to collect an image in a camera. There's the traditional way, which uses a strip of film. Either this can produce a negative or a positive image. Or today, you're probably more familiar with digital cameras, which we all have one pretty much in our smartphones, which collects the information as data and then transforms that visual information into tiny little blocks of color called pixels. But whether we're shooting with a traditional film camera, or a digital camera, or a phone, the basic sort of physics are the same. And those physics that make a camera work are also what makes your eye work. So when you look at something, light enters your eye, and you know this from our chapter on color. Your iris dilates to sort of allow the different amounts of light in, and then your lens sends an image to the back of your eyeball. So whatever you're looking at will appear upside down, and that's basically because light travels in a straight line. So if a light is bouncing off coming from the light source, bouncing off the top of an object, it will bounce sort of 90 degrees in a straight line, and the image will be flipped. But this means that literally in the back of your eye, at whatever you're looking at, is a tiny little image of whatever it is you're seeing upside down. So that means right now there is a tiny little image of this video with a tiny little image of me inside of your head. I'm inside your head, isn't that weird? And I'm upside down. What happens is that is then sent along your optic nerve. Your brain takes that information, it flips the image right side up, and there you go. We don't see upside down, thankfully. Now, the basic physics of this had been known for hundreds, really thousands of years. And in the 14 and 1500s, artists in Europe started to develop these devices called camera obscuras. And a camera obscura works on the same principle that I just described. You would have a box or a building with a hole in it. And then inside, the artist would put a wall or a partition, and they would put a piece of paper or a canvas, whatever they were going to put their image on the other side. Now they would take the things they wanted to paint or draw. In this case, we have an image of a person and a large vase, and the sunlight comes and hits this image. Because light travels in a straight line, it bounces off, travels through the hole, and it is flipped. And so what we would see is a projection of the image upside down on that piece of paper. And then the artist could actually trace this image to get a more lifelike and realistic image. Think of this as early Photoshop. And here's a much more simpler diagram showing you the same basic concept. And you could actually build one of these at home. If you wanted to build a traditional camera obscura, all you would need is a box with a hole in it. And so what you could do is you could cover up you could cover up the windows in your room, like the window behind me, and you could cover it with, say, a piece of cardboard and poke a pencil-sized hole in it. And then on the opposite wall, you would see in real time a live projection upside down of, well, whatever is happening on the outside of your home. Here's an example of that. This person simply covered up a window in their room. They poked a hole in it, and now we are seeing a time lapse of, as you can see, clouds and sky passing by. Rather cool, isn't it? And you don't need a lens or anything. You can just poke a hole in the little piece of cardboard and turn off all the lights in the room, and you'll see something like this. Or like this. This is a artier version of a camera obscura, but it's the same idea. Okay, so this is how a camera works. The trick is, though, here's the hard part. As soon as you cover up that hole, so if I were to cover up this hole, the image goes away, right? It blanks out. So how do I fix that? How do I make that image stick? Well, that's where photography comes in, because photography allows the image to burn into a surface. So to go back to photography, we have to go back to the early 1800s. Now, photography is one of those inventions where there's not one person we can sort of point to and say he or she invented photography, because it was very much a collaborative process, because photography is a complicated technology. It requires knowledge of physics and optics and chemistry. So it took a lot of different people to, pardon my pun, develop this new technology. But in 1819, an English scientist, a guy named John Herschel, discovered a chemical compound that could fix or make permanent camera obscura images. And then later on, an inventor, a woman named Anna Atkins, used that chemical and started to experiment with it. And what she would do is she would cover pieces of paper with this chemical and make what are called cyanotypes, because the images that were produced because of the light that was absorbed produced cyan-colored images. And then what she would do is she would lay stuff on top of that piece of paper. So in this case, she took pieces of algae, she laid them on top of this paper covered in this photosensitive chemical, and exposed it to the sun. And just sort of like with the silk screening or the screen printing that we saw, the areas that were exposed to the sunlight changed color and turned cyan. The parts of the paper that weren't exposed remained white as the color of the paper. So she basically produced kind of a reverse shadow, a negative of the image that she saw. Kind of cool, huh? But if we want to look at what we would call the first photograph, we would look at a French inventor, a guy named Nicephore Niepce. What a name, huh? And Niepce, working along with a guy named Daguerre, who we'll see in a moment, started to mess around with these chemicals and started to mess around with these processes that had already been around, and produced what we could consider to be the first photograph. Niepce took a small, basically a camera obscura, something very similar to what you see here, a box with a hole in it and a little lens on it. And then he took a piece of paper and he covered that piece of paper with a chemical called bitumen. What'd you call me? Bitumen, which is it's not actually a chemical, it's an element. And he put that bitumen covered piece of paper in the back of this little camera obscura. And then he took that box and he set it on a ledge outside of his studio overlooking a courtyard. And what he did is he took a picture with that. Now, this picture that you're seeing took 8 hours to photograph. It took 8 hours because it had what is known as an 8-hour exposure time. So what is an exposure time? Exposure time is the amount of time that in a camera the shutter is open. So when you take a picture, a shutter opens up, allowing light into the camera, like we see here. This is slowed down, thank you to the slow-mo guys. And it allows light to enter the camera, and then it shuts very quickly. Now in a camera today, the shutter is open just a fraction of a second. Because that's all it requires to allow enough light to come in so you can take a picture. But this being a new process, the chemicals worked very, very slowly, and they burned the image into the piece of paper, or it was actually a plate, it doesn't matter, into the surface very, very slowly. And this took 8 hours. And that's why this image looks weird. That's why there are shadows on both the east and west side of the courtyard, because you're seeing an entire day pass by in one image. So you're seeing morning and evening shadows all at once. Pretty crazy, pretty kooky, time compressed into one image. So photography was very impractical at this point. It was not easy to take a picture, and the results were rather blurry. If you want to see this, this is located at the University of Texas Harry Ransom Library, and it is on public display. You can just walk in and see the world's first photograph taken by Niepce. It's pretty cool. And it's also that it's here in Texas is another really awesome thing, I think. So let's talk about this other guy, Daguerre. Louis Daguerre is another major player in the invention of photography, and he invented a kind of photograph called the daguerreotype, which took pictures on plates. And you were looking at arguably the first image of a living human being. This was taken in Paris on a very busy street on the Boulevard du Temple during the middle of the day. And there were literally hundreds of people walking around on the sidewalks. There would have been dozens of horses and carriages on the streets. And yet, all we see is one man. The reason is because the exposure time was still very long. Now, by the time this image was made, which was 15 years later or so, the technology had gotten fast enough that the exposure time was 10 minutes. And you can see the image was much more crisp and much more clear. However, it was still too long for to catch anything in motion. So anything that was moving, like horses or people, would have, well, they're invisible. We don't see them. But this one guy, basically a guy standing there getting his shoe shined, made history simply from not moving. That's the kind of probably the way I would make history, right? Is just doing something or not doing something, and completely by random accident I would make history. I'm still hoping. 50 years into my life, and I'm hoping that one day I'll make history from doing absolutely nothing. I can dream. So, pretty cool. So the way this worked, these were some of the first commercially available cameras that were sold to the public. And they were invented by Daguerre along with help from Niepce. And they produced very clear images, but they were single prints. You couldn't make multiple prints from these. You just took one picture and that was it. So we're still not quite there yet with the ability to make multiple prints. It is not yet a mass production sort of technique. These early daguerreotypes, or daguerreotypes, I'm using the fancy French pronunciation, were mostly, though, with the exception of our lone Frenchman that we just saw, were typically of things that didn't move, of what we would call a still life. A still life is simply a picture or a painting of inanimate objects. Hence the name still life. But then we have a guy named William Henry Fox Talbot, who was able to create the first negatives using a technique called the calotype. This was invented by, like I said, William Henry Fox Talbot. What a great name. And he used a process involving silver iodine. And this becomes the basis of modern black and white film. So he could produce a piece of film. And then from that film, which would produce a negative, as you would see here, from that film, then he could produce a positive image and make multiple copies from this one negative image. Pretty cool, right? And this becomes the basis of modern photography. By creating negatives, you can produce multiple positives. So how does this work? So in a traditional, what we call darkroom photography, a camera is loaded with film, as you can see over here in the first image. And then you take your pictures. And then that film is loaded into a canister. Hopefully you don't expose it to light or you'll ruin the film. And then you take that into a darkroom where the negative is placed in a device called an enlarger. An enlarger is more or less a kind of a projector. There's a light bulb inside, and there is a lens that magnifies on the other end. And in between, you stick in your film, as you can see here, your negative. So the image would be, the lights would be black, and the whites would be black, and the blacks would be white. It's a negative image, just as we saw in this image here on the left. And then what happens is you can enlarge that really small negative picture by blowing it up onto a piece of paper that is treated with a photosensitive chemical. What happens then is the light shines through the white spots, turning those black onto the piece of paper. Next, what you want to do is you take that piece of paper and you put it in a chemical called a developer, and that's what you're seeing here on the right. The developer makes the chemicals react, and it brings that image out. And then you dip that into another chemical called the stop, which stops the developing process, and then you put that in what's known as the fixer, or the fix, which freezes the image, which fixes the image to the piece of paper. And voila, you have a photograph. And that for, 150 some odd years were mostly how photographs were developed until the invention of digital photography. So pretty neat stuff. Now the problem with these chemicals is that they can be very harmful to the environment. They're often poisonous and toxic chemicals that are used to make traditional photographs. In the mid-1990s, a guy named Scott A. Williams at the Rochester Institute of Technology invented a new chemical process that was based on coffee. And in fact, the process he called caffeinol. And it is an organic process that produces much safer images. Now, the point in some ways is almost moot because now most people use digital photography. But for those who still want to use this traditional form of photography, darkroom photography, can certainly use caffeinol instead, which is a much safer process. Kind of cool, huh? And then I guess if you get kind of tired in the darkroom, you could just drink the chemical. Don't drink the chemical. Don't do it. Okay, so once photography became this popular technology, there was a basic argument that photography was not art. In fact, a very famous English art critic, John Ruskin, said, "A photograph is not a work of art because only art expresses the personality, the activity, the living perception of a good and great human soul." There's this feeling that photography was a technology and it was basically cold and inhuman, and that it really couldn't express the views of the photographer. Now, we know better now. Certainly, I mean, we live in a world where people take pictures as a form of personal and emotional and artistic expression all the time, and we post them online all the time. But there is this, almost like with any new technology, right? Anytime there's a new technology, there's always a segment of the population who are freaking out that this technology could never replace the old traditional ways, and that it is somehow cold and inferior to the good old-fashioned way of doing things. This argument has been going on since, inventions have been invented. But this was certainly an argument at the time. So by the time we get to the 1850s and the 1860s, photography is widely available commercially. Home photography is still very rare because cameras are still really expensive. Film is still expensive, and the technology is still very difficult to use because if you want pictures, you more or less have to know how to develop pictures yourself and be familiar with the technology. However, around the world, photographic studios are opening up all over the place, and this photographic technology is becoming accessible to really anybody who wants it. And some of the first photographs produced in this stage of commercial photography in the 1850s and 1860s are portraits. Now, the earliest portraits for these in the 1850s, 1860s, you still have to hold still for some time. You can't move. But by this time, in the 1850s, the process, the exposure time has been whittled down to a matter of 10 to 20 seconds, depending on how much light is available. The more light you have, the shorter the exposure time. So you can hold a pose, for not, it doesn't have to be for a very long time to get your picture taken. And some of the first photographs produced during this kind of era of the portrait, of commercial photography, are portraits of celebrities. I mean, people have always been obsessed with celebrities. And there was a French photographer, a guy named Nadar, who was this really eccentric guy. He very famously was also not only a pioneer of photography, but also a balloonist. And he took some of the first aerial photographs ever. He flew a balloon over Paris and took photographs of it, and it created this huge sort of big deal. It was this sort of this huge rage over it. It was really awesome. But he took pictures of people like this woman here, Sarah Bernhardt, who was a very, very famous actress of the stage during her day. In fact, he probably made her more famous by taking her picture. So, photography, photographs. This is another very famous photograph. This is not in your book, but I want to include it here because it's an important photograph. This is a picture by an American photographer named Mathew Brady of President Abraham Lincoln, although he wasn't president when this was taken. President Lincoln, or future President Lincoln, was on the campaign trail, and he was in New York, and he goes into Mathew Brady's studio to take this picture before he makes a speech at Cooper Union College. And the Cooper Union portrait and the Cooper Union speech are very important in Lincoln's political career, because in this speech, Lincoln lays down his plans for the future of slavery in this country, in the United States. And he says that no new states allowed into the Union can be slave states. This speech, which is very eloquent and a very beautiful speech, is printed up in newspapers and distributed all around the country. And, you couldn't listen to the radio or watch TV back then. And so this is how people became familiar with what politicians had to say. They read speeches in the paper. At the same time, Lincoln went by Mathew Brady's studio, and he had hundreds and hundreds of these photographs printed up. And he handed them out on the campaign trail. And these were called carte de visites, or visiting cards. And these carte de visites, think of these as like really fancy business cards. And he would hand them out. He would also sell them for donations to his campaign. And it was a really cool thing, because for the first time ever, people could have photographs of their president or their future president or of a politician they supported. And Lincoln, I think before any other major politician in this country at least, understood the importance of this new technology. He understood the power of the photograph, and he understood that you could sell yourself and your campaign and your ideas based on your image. Now, whether this is ultimately a good or a bad thing, it doesn't matter, because image is everything now, especially in politics. But Lincoln was one of the first people to really capitalize on this. In fact, he very famously said, it was my Cooper Union speech printed in the papers and Mathew Brady's photographs that got me elected president. He understood the power of mass media in politics in a way that no politician before him really had before. But also, these portraits represent something really important. They represent the concept of a new way that people had access to images. Sorry, that was much harder to get out than I intended. Before photographs, if you wanted a picture of something, you more or less had to be rich. You had to have a lot of money to be able to afford an artist to paint or draw a portrait of somebody. And this meant that images were for the wealthy. And that also meant that all images were made for a wealthy and powerful audience. So whether you are, they wanted a picture of a family member or a picture of a, working class person down the street, those images were made for an audience of wealthy people. It also meant that the image could only be as accurate and as good as the accuracy of the artist making those images, right? It also meant that images, it was rare to be able to record an image while something was happening. So, for example, if you wanted to record an image of a battle or any sort of famous historical moment, that image typically was made weeks or months or even years after the fact based on historical records. But what photography did, it allowed people to go and get an image made. So anybody could get a picture. If you wanted a picture of your Aunt Mabel, you sent her down to your local photographic studio, and for not a lot of money, you could have dozens of pictures of Aunt Mabel printed up. And this meant for the first time, human beings had access to pictures of themselves. They had pictures of their family members in a way they never had before. So these are pictures from, the one on the left is from my childhood, and the one on the right is of my father and my grandfather. Now, this new technology, photography, gave us the abilities to capture our own lives. Anybody from any social sort of strata, the richest to the poorest, could afford this technology, and for the first time, anybody could record their lives. So what photography did is it democratized the image. Because if you go back and look at any image produced before the invention of photography, you were looking at images made by and for the wealthy and powerful. And they only provide the worldview of the wealthy and powerful. And now with this new technology, we see the world through the eyes of any and everybody. It is an astounding invention. It is an invention that literally changed the way we see our world and what determines who gets to depict their view and vision of their world. But photography does something else that might be even more important. The image on the left is an image that was taken when I was probably around 3 years old. It's from a park in Fredericksburg, Texas, where my parents and would take us on trips during the summer because my mom was down that part of Texas. Now, I have this image burned in my mind. I remember that Donald Duck seesaw like the back of my hand. I remember it vividly, but not from my own memory. I was much too young to remember this clearly, especially with any sort of detail. And I was way beyond being able to remember what I would have been wearing, that I would have been wearing red shorts with red shoes. Quite stylish, I might add. I would not have been able to remember that because our early memories are vague or even non-existent. Because when we're children, we remember with parts of our brain that later on we don't remember with. It's like having stuff on a hard drive that you lose. And so we don't start developing really permanent, tangible memories until around 3 years old. Some people maybe a little bit earlier, but for most of us it's 3 or 4. And yet I remember this vividly. Why? Because I have seen this image my entire life. I have seen it when my parents would take out the photo albums. I have seen it when I'm moving and opened boxes of old photos and gone through them. I now have this memory embedded in my brain with an accuracy that would have been impossible before the invention of photographs. And I could show you a million pictures like that. I'm sure you have them too. Photography changed the way we remember. I mean, think about all the millions of times you've gone on social media and you've scrolled through images from not that long ago, 6 months, a year ago, whatever, and you were reminded of things that you totally forgot. You're reminded of places you've been or parties you've gone to, or maybe even people that you've known and maybe even worked with or whatever that you had forgotten existed. But that photograph reminds you. Photography gave us a clarity and a length of memory that would have been impossible to have before. But it also did something even weirder. The weirdest thing that photography did was it allowed us to remember things that never even happened to us. The image on the right is a picture of my father and my grandfather. This is an image I've seen quite a few times over my life. This is a picture of my grandfather, his birthday. I can't remember how old he is here. But my grandfather died 2 years before I was born. And yet I have very vivid memories of what he looked like because I have seen dozens and dozens of pictures of him throughout my life. But what's even crazier is not only now do I have memories of people I've never met, I can have memories of places I've never been. I have memories of Antarctica. I've never been to Antarctica, but I've seen pictures of it. I have memories of Mars. I've never been to Mars, although some people might think I'm from there, but I've never been. And yet I have memories of it because I've seen pictures of it. That's insane. That is a supernatural, superhuman ability that has been given to us. And we take this for granted because we grow up with pictures. And we don't even think about how they've changed our lives. So imagine growing up in a world where you've never seen your president. That seems impossible, doesn't it? And that's the world that Lincoln changed, that he altered with Mathew Brady's photograph. Mathew Brady also gave us some of the first ever realistic pictures of war. Mathew Brady, after the Civil War broke out, he approached Congress and asked if he could take pictures and document the war. Now, the Civil War is not the first war to ever be photographed, but it is the first war to be photographed extensively. And almost every major officer, every major battle, every major location was photographed by Mathew Brady or people working under Mathew Brady. The sad story is Mathew Brady never was reimbursed for his photographs. He thought that maybe later Congress would pay him, and they never did. If you want to see his photographs, you can go to the Library of Congress website and see the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos that he and his other photographers working for him took. And they provide one of the richest visual documents of any moment in American history. And for that alone, Mathew Brady, his name needs to be shouted from the mountaintops. And yet he died destitute and bitter and broke. But Mathew Brady provided for the first time for many, many people a document, an objective view of history, or at least as close to objective as a human being can get. An objective-ish view of history in a way that had never been provided before. Like I said before, photographs or any sort of historical image was made years after the fact generally. But Mathew Brady could photograph things as they happened or due to the exposure time right after, they happened. He couldn't take a picture of soldiers fighting in a battle, but he could take pictures of their bodies afterwards. The image on the left, though, is interesting because I said Mathew Brady took objective documentary photos. But that's not completely true. He would often move hands and arms and reposition the bodies of dead soldiers, for instance, creating something that is subjective. Subjective means, well, this is important. What's objective? Objective means without bias. An objective statement would be, this is a mechanical pencil, right? There's no bias, no opinion, nothing. A subjective statement would be, this is an uncomfortable mechanical pencil because the little clip is broken and it digs into my hand if I write with it the wrong way. Or this is a crappy mechanical pencil because the lead keeps sliding in and out, or the piece of graphite. I know. keep sliding in and out of the casing. Anyway, but Mathew Brady, is basically saying these photographs can be completely objective, but they're not. There's some subjectivity here, but certainly photographs allowed us to be more objective than ever before. Julia Margaret Cameron is a photographer that lived and worked in England. She was a wealthy aristocrat whose daughters gave her a camera for her birthday when she was in her 40s. And Julia Margaret Cameron started to take pictures of her friends. So technically, Julia Margaret Cameron is an amateur. Now, amateur is a word that we often misuse. Amateur literally means somebody who does something for the love of it, as opposed to a professional who does something because they're getting paid to do it. It's not a qualifier about ability, though, right? An amateur can take great photographs. An amateur can have a lot of experience taking photographs. It just means they're not getting paid. Although now we use the terms sort of more loosely. An amateur means somebody who is not as skilled as somebody who's professional, but it really doesn't mean that. It just means somebody who does it for the love of it. It has the root word is amor, right? For the love of. But Julia Margaret Cameron started taking pictures of her friends. Since she's a wealthy aristocrat, her friends were people like the famous poet Alfred Lord Tennyson and the naturalist Charles Darwin. Julia Margaret Cameron, though, while she took portraits, wanted them to not look like photographs. And you can see that in this image here of Alfred Lord Tennyson. She is intentionally shaking the camera to give it a blurry look because she wants it to look more like a painting. She wants to put sort of an artistic spin on it. And that is, well, think about that. Why? Well, if you think about it, it's because photographers didn't have anybody else to borrow from. Photography was a new medium, and most images that they had seen were made by painters and, people who drew. So they took from what they knew. And so Julia Margaret Cameron wanted to create this blurry effect that sort of replicated a brushstroke. So she shook the camera to make it blurry, to make it look more like a painting. But we are now looking at something called pictorialism, which is the opposite of a documentary photograph. A documentary photograph just simply documents in as objective a way as possible with no interference of the artist and takes a picture of whatever is going on. But Julia Margaret Cameron doesn't want to do that. Pictorial is where the artist manipulates an image to be more than an objective record, but rather a subjective work of art. So she would use filters and weird lenses and shake the camera and do all these different things to create these sort of artistic kinds of photographs. She would also not take pictures of real-life events, but instead she would dress her subjects up and recreate scenes from the Bible, like this angel here, or scenes from the stories of King Arthur, or great events from history, or whatever. She would create these fictional stories, these pictorials. So a pictorial is when an artist or when a photographer is taking an image to be a work of art and not just a record, not just a document of an event. And I still love her work. You can tell a Julia Margaret Cameron picture from a million miles away because it has such a distinctive style, such a distinctive artistic sort of voice, I think. The blurriness is always a dead giveaway. The lighting is always a dead giveaway. The costumes. But there's a dreamlike, almost fairy tale quality to her work, that I find fascinating. I love her work. This is a good time to bring up another important change that photography brought. So the role of women in photography has always been very important. So we've talked a little bit about this before, but women in art, especially in European and American art, the Western world as we call it, women played a minor role really up until very recently, up until the middle 1800s. And the reason is because women typically weren't allowed to be artists. They weren't allowed to apprentice under an artist during the Renaissance and the Middle Ages and even through the 15, 16, 1700s. They weren't often allowed into art academies, into art schools. A lot of women artists, the ones that did achieve any sort of success, tended to come from families where they had brothers or fathers or husbands who were artists, and they learned and honed their craft that way. But there were many societies throughout European history that did not permit women, or made it very, very difficult for women to be artists. And so it was very difficult for women to have a career. In fact, it was very difficult for women to have a career at all, in any sort of really skilled labor in a lot of European societies. But photography changes that. Because artists like Julia Margaret Cameron had access to photography in a way that they didn't have access to, say, painting or drawing. And the reason is because there were no photography schools when photography first started. There was nobody to say no to these women. There was nobody to keep them out of the industry. So all you had to do to be a photographer was to be able to get hold of a camera, and you could start taking pictures. And so, like in the same way that photography democratized the image and gave the lower classes the ability to record our own lives for the first time, it also gave women the ability to depict their own lives in a way that was very difficult beforehand. And now there were, we have studied and will study a handful of women artists before the 1850s, 1860s in this class, but they are outliers. They are few and far between. And so most women that we see in art were painted by men, painted with a man's opinion. But with photography now, women have the ability to represent themselves and to record their own lives from their own viewpoints and this whatever subject matter they are interested in. So this is an incredibly important aspect of what photography did to change the way we see the world. For the first 50 or so years of commercially available photography, photography was very expensive, and it was something that was not affordable from your average sort of worker. But in the 1880s, in 1888 to be exact, an American company named Kodak, under the leadership of a man named George Eastman, created the Kodak Camera. The Kodak Camera was the first affordable camera. It's the three things that everybody likes. It's cheap, fast, and easy. What'd you say about my mom? No, I'm joking. But cheap, fast, and easy. Cheap. It was only $25. Which even at that time was not a lot of money. Your average worker could save up a few paychecks and afford a camera. Easy to use. It was, you didn't have to be able to understand how a darkroom works. You could send off the camera, which came preloaded with film, and send it into Kodak, and they would develop it for you. And then fast. It took pictures very quickly. No longer did you have to wait on 10-second exposure times, but it could take photographs almost instantaneously. So this was an incredible development. Once again, pardon the pun. So that leads us to something called pure photography. An American named Alfred Stieglitz, he's one of the first to emphasize what he considered to be the particular strengths of this photographic medium, its clarity and realism. And he took advantage of this new Kodak camera. This is a very famous picture called the Steerage. And this is on a steamer ship traveling from Europe to America. And Stieglitz describes taking this picture. So first of all, what is steerage? Steerage are the lower decks on a vessel at the time. Think of the Titanic and these big steamer ships that would travel from Europe to America and really all around the world. And the lower decks are where the poor people stayed. And these tended to be pretty terrible in terms of the conditions. There was disease, they were the cramped. It was not a nice place to be. And one day, Stieglitz is walking past these areas called the steerage, these lower decks, and he takes this picture. And for him, it was perfect. He didn't set up the shot. He didn't pose anybody. He didn't tell anybody what to do, but instead he captured the pure moment. This is where we get the name pure photography, and this is a form of documentary photography. And for Stieglitz, this is, for him, what photography can do that no other medium can do, which is capture the pure moment. And not only the emotion of the moment, and not only the truth of the moment. And that's important, because here we see the truth of the inequality of the poor classes compared to the working class, to the richer classes, the upper classes. But not only that, but also pure in its aesthetic. For him, it's not about setting up the perfect shot, but capturing natural beauty. And in this image, he talks about how the way the column here, the smokestack, intersects the plank here, and the way the design of the lines carry the eye from the left to the right. So he's talking about the formal elements here, as well as he's talking about the emotion and the story that he captures. And for him, this is it. This is pure photography, capturing that pure moment. The artist, the photographer, just kind of steps out of the way and lets the camera capture the pure moment. And there's lots of other photographers who kind of followed this line of thinking. One of them is an American artist named Ansel Adams, who became very famous taking pictures of our national parks here in the United States. And in fact, he was so impactful. He belonged to a conservation club called the Sierra Club, that was dedicated to preserving America's wilderness. And one of the things that put the Sierra Club on the map was Ansel Adams' photographs, these stunning photographs of the American West, like Yosemite Park and Yellowstone Park, and etc. And for Ansel Adams, what he's doing is pure photography. He's not setting up a shot. He's not posing anybody. But at the same time, he kind of is, right? I mean, no photograph is purely objective. He's deciding where to aim that camera. I could tell you this, if you gave me a camera and you said take a picture like Ansel Adams, I could not do it. Because he's making, even if they're subconscious, he's making artistic choices. Not only when he takes the picture, but also when he develops the picture in the darkroom, he's choosing what chemicals to use, what kinds of filters to use, how long to keep that picture in the developer. He's making a lot of artistic choices. Pardon me, 3, 2, 1. Along the way. So it's not just, pure photography is not so pure, right? Just like no image can be purely objective, because as long as you have a human being behind the camera making decisions, you are going to have subjectivity. Another famous pure photographer is a photographer named Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange took pictures of the American Dust Bowl during the Great Depression, which began in 1929, after the stock market crashes. This leaves this country and many countries around the world in an economic depression. And this alone created a tremendous amount of hardship for many, many people. People lost their jobs. Small farms went out of business because there's not people buying their products. It's a chain reaction. To make matters worse, in the American Midwest, sort of from North Texas up through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, it is a disaster because there's also an ecological disaster called the Dust Bowl. Years and years and years of poor farming practice basically scraped away the top layer of soil on the fields. And there was a few years of drought. This dried out that topsoil. And so when these big prairie winds would blow by, it created these huge dust storms. And these dust storms could be massive. They were sometimes hundreds of feet tall, blackening out the sky. People were inhaling dust, getting sick. It was horrible. But it also meant that this farmland, which was once fertile and rich, was no longer viable. And farms started to really go out of business. What made problems even worse is that there's a depression going on. And banks were going bankrupt. This is before banks were federally insured. So banks could go bankrupt. If you had a loan out with a bank, you lost your loan. You lost your money. If your farm wasn't making any money and you needed to borrow some money, well, there were often not banks around to loan you money. And so this meant that hundreds of thousands of small farms throughout the American Midwest went broke. Now, the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, began several programs, government-sponsored programs, to get people back to work and try to stimulate the economy. And one of the things he created was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. And the WPA was designed to create projects like Hoover Dam, things like that, to get people back to work. And the WPA built high schools and all sorts of things. But also what the WPA did was it tried to get artists back to work. And one of the things it did was it hired photographers to document the struggles of these people in the Midwest, their struggles with the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Because what happens is many of these, what they're called Okies, because a lot of them came from Oklahoma, although not exclusively, but they were sort of known as Okies. A lot of these Okies started to head to California, to migrate to California, to get access to the more or less good economy there in California as laborers, as fruit pickers, and working on farms. The problem was, even though California had a relatively healthy economy and had escaped the Dust Bowl, there still weren't enough jobs for all these Okies. And so there were millions and millions of people pouring in to California, and there was no work. So a lot of them were staying in these itinerant worker camps. And the government wanted to document how many people there were and the conditions they were living in so they could hopefully provide some sort of assistance. So Dorothea Lange was one of these workers, one of these photographers hired by the Farm Bureau to photograph these migrant Okies. And one day she goes into a small little labor camp in California, and she meets a woman named Florence Thompson, and she takes her picture. Actually, she took a series of pictures, but she chose this image here. And this image was published in a local California newspaper. And then a few weeks later, it was published in Life magazine. And it became one of the most recognizable images of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression era. Because for many people it encapsulated sort of what people were struggling, what they were going through, the hardships that they were experiencing. And it is a phenomenal photograph. It is deeply moving to think that this woman was only 30 years old. And the story is that she was stranded, that she got to this camp, couldn't find work, and she had to sell the tires off of her car to help provide food for her children. And Dorothea Lange finds her in this little lean-to, this little shack with very little protection from the elements, surrounded by her children. What we don't see is that she had an extended family with other members who were out looking for work or were working. And that gets into a deeper problem with this photograph. First of all, Florence Thompson was never identified in this photograph. She was just known as a migrant mother. So she was sort of rendered faceless, not faceless, but without an individuality. She was just kind of a victim, right? Just a victim of these horrible circumstances. And she becomes a symbol for the Great Depression. And this becomes one of the most famous photographs, I would say, in history. But it always upset Florence Thompson because, first of all, she wasn't named, and second of all, she was embarrassed by this photograph, conversely, ironically. That she didn't want to be shown at her worst and become this sort of symbol for poverty and struggle. And also the fact that it portrayed her as being alone and abandoned when she had a much larger family with her that simply aren't shown. So this gets into the problem once again of subjectivity and objectivity in a photograph. We see an image that initially seems to be completely objective, completely truthful, but the further we dig deep, the more we realize that's not the case. Also, there is something here that has literally been erased. If you look closely, you can see that there's a sort of blur here, a kind of a phantom image. That is Florence Thompson's thumb. But Dorothea Lange didn't like the way it looked, and so she erased it. Today, we would say she photoshopped it out. They didn't have Photoshop, but she used photo trickery to remove the thumb because it made a better photograph. So this isn't an objective photograph at all. This isn't pure photography. This isn't a document, 100%. But there is the subjectivity of the photographer. Despite all that, you can't deny the power of this image. This young woman who looks aged well beyond her years, struggling for survival in this harsh economy with very little recourse. And a lot of people identified with this image. It also opened up a lot of Americans' eyes to the struggles of these Midwesterners, these Okies, who were migrating to California. Now, many years later in the 1980s, Florence Thompson got sick with, I believe, cancer. And in a local newspaper, her family, basically, there was an article published about her. Her family went to this newspaper and said that she needed help. And tens of thousands of people donated money to her because they were all so moved by this photograph. And in her later life, Florence Thompson changed her mind a little bit about this photograph, that she was rather embarrassed by it for most of her life. But once she realized how much this photograph meant to people and how moved they were and how many people identified with this photograph, and it became a part of them and part of American culture, she changed her mind and realized that she was now kind of part of this larger history. Photographs are powerful things, guys, and whether they're completely true or not, we find our own truths in them. But photographs used as a way to expose the world to parts of society or to injustices or to struggles that we are not normally aware of is something that photographs can do very well. There was a photographer named Louis Wicks Hine who was a photojournalist. He took pictures for newspapers, who was aghast at the way children were treated in large factories in this country. And he impersonated inspectors and salesmen and got into these factories and took pictures of these children, sometimes as young as 12 as the little girl here, and even younger. And they were in horrible shape. They worked, 12, 13, 14, 16 hours a day sometimes with very few breaks. Some of the children were injured. They were working in industries that caused them that exacerbated medical conditions, that caused injuries, that shortened their lives. And because of his photographs of these child workers, he helped Congress saw these images and passed some foundational labor laws that governed the working practices of hiring children and how many hours they could work and things like that. So these photojournalists um, like Dorothea Lange, like Louis Wicks-Hine, contributed a lot to the betterment and benefit of this country. Photojournalists also give us an insight into the world around us and the struggles outside of our own country. Very famously, a photographer named Steve McCurry, who's famous for his photographs for National Geographic magazine, photographed the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the early 1980s. He photographed this young woman here, this girl, whose parents had both been killed by the Soviets, and her family had fled. Her brothers and sisters and her grandmother had fled and walked the snow-covered mountains to Pakistan at a very young age. And then he took this picture when she was in a refugee camp. And I remember this as a child. This was the front cover of a National Geographic magazine that year. And it was one of those photographs that when it came out, everybody talked about it. Not only the sort of struggles and the conditions of this young girl, but also her face, this look of fear, and those incredible eyes that Steve McCurry photographed. And look how he's using the formal elements. What makes her eyes are stunning as they are, but what makes them really pop? What makes these green eyes pop? Our good old buddy simultaneous contrast and the use of the complementary color red around her. And the way he's framed this photograph, using this sort of greenish blue contrast with the red, contrasted with the greenish blue of her eyes, creates this incredible, incredible simultaneous contrast. Many years later, and almost 20 years later, he returned to Pakistan. And you know, there was cultural differences. She belonged to a very strict religious sect that did not allow men to talk to women. And he never actually ever said any words directly to her. But when he had to struggle to find her, he had to hire translators, he had to search all over Pakistan until he finally found this woman almost 18 years later and took her picture again. But Steve McCurry talks about when he saw her, he immediately knew from her eyes that it was the same little girl he'd photographed so many years before. If you like Steve McCurry, I highly recommend looking at his work because it is just absolutely stunning. He uses color in a way that very few artists of any sort of type, photographer, painters, I think he understands color in an incredible way. Photo collage and photo montage. These are related categories. And in fact, I would say there's no real difference here. Technically, a photo collage are unique works that are not generally reproduced, and photo montages are made to be reproduced. It's a stupid distinction, and I don't know why your book makes it. But what they are, both techniques involve cutting up a picture and cutting up a series of pictures or words or text, whatever, and pasting them. So collage with photographs and making montages or collages out of them. This was something pioneered during World War I and in a European art movement called Dada. The whole idea of Dada was to sort of poke fun of and to attack these structures, the institutions that created the conditions that led to World War I. So this meant governments and government officials, this meant religion, this meant schools, and this meant really sort of any sort of foundational institution. They just mercilessly made fun of. And the Dada style is often very confrontational. It's also very experimental, and it can also be somewhat disturbing. But the artist Hannah Hook is one of the pioneers of photo collage and photo montage. And she created these rather incredible, still really sort of futuristic looking in many ways, very contemporary looking images where she would take political figures and sort of skew them and turn them into these kind of surreal, grotesque, kind of cartoonish kinds of images, very much making fun of the power structures of the day. Here we see a more modern use of photo collage or photo montage with the use of Photoshop. This is an artist named Stephen Mark, an African-American artist who often layers images to create these narratives that sort of draw a line between the history of black people from modern day to the antebellum, the pre-Civil War South. And we see this image of this very famous, very infamous plantation, Cedar Grove plantation from Vicksburg, Mississippi, with images related to sort of the pre-Civil War South, cotton fields, things like that, explicit references to slavery. But then we also see an image of a modern man with a Phi Beta Sigma brand, a very popular and well-known African-American fraternity. And the artist here is sort of drawing a correlation between the concept of branding, where branding in the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, was a symbol of ownership of slaves, and now it is a symbol of sort of dignity and respect and selfhood. But he's doing this through layering these different images using this modern technology of Photoshop. But the concept is not inherently different than what we saw with Hannah Hulk earlier, and her hand cutting out the images with scissors and digitally cutting and pasting the images. The concept is sort of the same, and the idea is that it's a way of reframing the past or even the present by taking images that are already out there and appropriating them and taking those images and making them your own. Telling your own story with other people's images is a way of giving voices to people who don't often have voices, I guess. Okay. Back to pictorialism. So pictorialism doesn't go away. I want to show you some modern examples. One of them is an artist named Sandy Scoggin, an American artist who creates these surreal sort of landscapes. All of this is done before Photoshop. She would often go to great pains designing these sets and building props and things to create these rather funny, surreal kinds of environments. But an artist I really want to focus on, and we're going to wrap up this chapter with, is an artist named Cindy Sherman. Cindy Sherman is a photographer who came about in the 1970s, kind of riding the wave of the feminist movement of the 1970s. But she's an artist who created a series of photos called untitled film stills. So what does that mean? What is an untitled film still? What's a film still? A film still is a photograph taken from a movie. Simple enough. But in the old days, before VCRs and DVDs and Blu-rays and even streaming, movies, theaters, and other places, collectible places, things like that, would sell these film stills. Because if a movie came out to the theater, the only way to see it again was to go back to the theater, see it a second time or third time, whatever it was. And then maybe a few years down the line, it would show up on TV, and then you would watch it, and then you wouldn't get to see it again until it showed up on TV again. This is what it was like in the old days before the ability to record media. Yeah, it sucked. It sucked a lot. I remember my parents got my brother and I a film still of Star Wars when I was 6 years old, and we went to go see Star Wars. Anyway. But Cindy Sherman did a funny thing here. She made film stills for movies that don't exist. She created a series of over 80 black and white photos, and she uses sort of female stereotypes. Housewives and young girls in the city for the first time, cheerleaders, those kinds of stereotypical women that would have been seen in the films that she grew up watching in sort of the 50s and the 60s. And she intentionally makes her films, or film stills, obviously fake. In fact, here you can actually see the cord that goes to the shutter. So, this is before wireless remotes. The camera she is controlling it by this cord here, and she's blatantly showing it to us. And she's obviously wearing a wig in a lot of these. In some of these images, she's wearing costumes. But she says, in college I began to collect a lot of discarded accoutrements from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, more in my own personal wardrobe, as well as for the sheer fascination with what those garments stood for. It was easy and cheap to collect all kinds of things in those days. I've always played with makeup to transform myself, but everything, including the lighting, was self-taught. I just learned things as I needed to use them. I absorbed my ideas for the women in these photos from every cultural source that I've ever had access to, including film, TV, advertisement, magazines, as well as any adult role models from my youth. So here's what she's doing. Let me move my thing out of the way. She's taking these sort of stereotypical portrayals of women from movies, old movies, and she's putting them into movies that she's not telling us the title of. Because what Cindy Sherman wants us to do is to basically come up with the story. Cindy Sherman understands that pictures, the story of a picture is not just what the artist tells it is, but the story is what we bring to it. You know, I could take 30 students to a museum, and we could all look at the same work of art, and I could have 30 different interpretations, 30 different takeaways from that same work of art. Some might find it beautiful, some might find it ugly, some might find it funny, some might find it disturbing. And so Cindy Sherman understands this. And so by sort of giving us these kind of stereotypical images, but not giving us the name of the movie, in a way, these say more about us than they say about her. She's just playing a role. She's anonymous here. She's not Cindy Sherman. She's just an actress in a costume, playing a housewife or a girl in a window, or however you want to interpret these different roles. She almost kind of disappears. She looks like a completely different person. And we bring our own biases, we bring our own feelings to this. And this is something, if we do meet in class, I want to take a look at together. But when you look at this image, ask yourself, what is the story? What kind of movie is this? What kind of story is being told? Is this a romantic movie? Is it a comedy? Is it a horror movie? Why is this woman out on the road by herself? How did she get there? Why is she waiting there? Who is she waiting for? What is going to happen in the next scene? Is somebody going to drive by and pick her up? Who will it be? What will be her fate? Those sorts of questions say more about you than they do about her, right? These are not about her. These are about the way we interpret images. And these can be based on whether you're male or female, what kinds of movies you watch, what kinds of stories you like, your general outlook. Are you a positive or negative person? These all influence what we see when we look at these images. And because of that, I find her work fascinating, because they're not about the story she's telling. They're about the stories we tell ourselves when we look at a picture. And also, I love this, obviously, the kind of fun that she's having, playing these roles, playing a housewife or a young girl in the city or a bad girl. And there's a falseness. She often uses sort of the techniques of old Hollywood, like the fake projections in the background, to give this an even more of a made-up kind of quality. She's not pretending that this isn't real. In fact, she's emphasizing the fact that it's a fiction, that it's not real at all. All right, that's it, guys. See you next time.